And for those who are interested.
And hello and happy Tuesday to the illustrious Ways and Means Committee. Today is May 20th, Tuesday, and we are just getting started. Sources scheduled one report a day for the week, as per our conversation last week. And we are going to start off talking about the basic needs report with Pat Titterton from JFO. And then spending after that, we're going to talk about S123. I think report earlier in the session. Yes, but it might be but a faint memory, and it might be helpful for us to think about it in the context of our work for next year or the summer. So he's back.
I am Patrick Titterton of the Joint Fiscal Office, and I also have a slight surprise for you all.
Ooh.
I actually technological pause.
Any things are saying that.
I think we are still live.
Great. Your screen sharing disappeared though.
Yeah, let's try and get that working. Habits?
Yes.
Great. So I'm gonna basically just start by kind of just giving an explanation of what the basic needs budget is, and from that, what a livable wage is and how, because these are all things that are defined in statute, so it's a statutory required report. And so just some of that background. So basic needs mean the essentials needed to run a household. And then the things that are called out in statute are food, housing, transportation, childcare, utilities, health and dental care, taxes, rental and life insurance, personal expenses, and savings. So the basic needs budget is what amount of money do you need to be able to afford the amount of these goods to hit your everyday basic needs, essentially. What's the cost of all those things you need to live in Vermont? So like I said, I listed off those several items that are required by statute. There are a few things that we do include in the report as spending categories that are not listed out specifically in statute. You might think they should be, but just rest assured, clothing, a basic need, we think, is not in statute, but we do include it in the report, along with telecommunications, your cell phone, what have you. And actually new for this report are personal care products, which for some reason, going back to, I think it was like 1999 when this report first came out, personal care products wasn't included. I think toothpaste, shampoo. So if anything, maybe just to highlight, the report kind of evolves with what we include with, things that become more essential to daily life. Think like telecommunications might not have been quite as important 25 years ago.
What are household expenses?
Household expenses, think a rug or a sofa or, just other sort of household items that don't necessarily fit into one of these other categories that we have here. Different than miscellaneous expenses, because that is just kind of purely something that's miscellaneous. Just doesn't fit into any broader category. And I'll tell you now, the methodology we use for that particular one is a little bit more art than science. Think newspaper, cup of coffee. How much do you really need of that? But it gives you we're sort of building in an allowance essentially for, kind of everyday goods that you don't necessarily need, but you would reasonably expect someone living at a reasonable, like a good lifestyle would be able to afford, sort of, maybe not the most expensive thing, but they should be able to go to see a movie at the theater or something. So, that's the basic, or that's what basic needs are, and the basic needs budget are in statute. Livable wage is also something that is expressly defined in statute. It's the hourly wage required in an urban or rural area for a full-time worker who lives in shared housing and has an employer-assisted health insurance to pay for the basic needs budget. Now, you'll see in a couple slides, we don't just do this this family configuration for the report. And actually, this is a very new change to focus on this household type, the single person living in shared housing. Think a single person living with a roommate. Used to be just two adults with no children. And sort of the basic assumptions we use for things like taxes and housing was that they were cohabitating or married. Because that does come into play when you think about things like economies of scale of like sharing costs. You don't need to duplicate every purchase on things that are typically not shared between two people who are not cohabitating. And then, so this is a biennial report. The 2024 report was published this past January. Next summer, we'll be working on the next iteration of this report for the next biennium. And so we do the report every 2 years. So the purpose of the report is to calculate the cost to afford a household's basic needs in Vermont and the wage required to afford those needs without public assistance. So I guess that point right there is sort of important. One of the underlying assumptions in all of this is that these people are able to afford these basic needs without relying on any kind of public assistance. Now you'll see maybe a little later on, there are some things we include from the tax code, like with the child tax credit. There are the child care subsidies, the CCFAP, which are factored into the calculations. Some people often ask me, well, is that public assistance? There are some cases where we actually look at something and say, well, maybe that's a public good rather than maybe a public assistance program, or, all of the income ranges for these budgets we're calculating are well within eligibility thresholds for these programs. So for that reason, just to kind of keep it in step with reality of Vermont as it is today, we'll include them. And just importantly, the report is not meant to be a mandate. It doesn't define any sort of state benefits eligibility. It's more of a reference point, or maybe a means of comparison when thinking about wage data. And I do know that some employers do maybe reference it, if not fully set their wage scale based on it. We have heard that some people, outside the State House do reference it, but and nowhere is it used as like this is the level, this is what you have to pay people. It's not the minimum wage in Vermont or anything like that. So some of the basic assumptions we use. These are the 7 configurations, household configurations we use. There's single person, the single person shared housing, which is the basis for the sort of quote unquote official livable wage, the one that's defined in statute. And then we've got a few different iterations of households with children. And then just the last one, just two adults with no children was the sort of basis for the previous official livable wage amount. This doesn't capture every living arrangement, obviously. And, that's something we get feedback on sometimes. How do you think about all the different iterations of living arrangements people have? Another thing is we do have the urban and rural areas defined in this way in the report. Basically, Chittenden County is the basis for the urban data. The rest of the state makes up or accounts for the rural data when used for the comparison. That's obviously not perfect. But, sometimes we're a little beholden to how, federal agencies define certain areas for where they collect data, and we have to rely on that for the calculations. So some of it's inside and some of it's outside of our hands is all. So yeah, the urban and the rural areas. And then we do have to end.
There used to be different labor market areas, and now in Vermont, there's only about one, and then towns and stuff. I mean, it used to be like the Killington, Woodstock.
Yeah.
That doesn't exist anymore. It used to
I
be
don't-
Mary, Montclair, it doesn't exist anymore.
I don't believe so. I think that might have been retired, although one thing I would mention about that is always really important when thinking about this report is we rely on a lot of survey data. And one thing that's pretty consistent in Vermont is that our survey results are not typically very reliable, just sample size is all it really is. So we do get a lot of people wondering why we can't be more granular on, to look at some of these areas. And the reality would probably just end up being the data is really unreliable. So broadly speaking, this is a way to capture two big swaths where we can sort of maximize our sample sizes. But with everything and, with any assumption for anything, it's not always perfect and doesn't apply to every single case. We do have to make some assumptions on some sort of like the demographic profile of who the adults and the children are. So single persons and single parents. This previously used to be for single adult households, we would assume it was a woman. And then recently we've shifted that to be single persons and single parents at the average cost between a adult male and female between the ages of 20 to 50 years old.
Wait. When you changed what happens when you changed it from assuming it was a woman to assuming that it was the average between a man and a woman?
So it comes into play. So the reason we have some of these assumptions is some of the data that we use, they distinguish in that way between gender and age. And in particular for this one, the food budget that we use is set by the USDA and they do the differentiation. And so for 20 to 50-year-old adult, the female food budget is actually lower than the male food budget. So in effect, by taking the average between the two here, it brought that budget up a little bit.
Is like the pink tax included in like the miscellaneous and the household?
So for that, we use the Consumer Expenditure Survey, and I don't believe they differentiate based on gender. So it's possible it's partially accounted for, not at all accounted for. But I have in a couple slides some of the changes. There was a technical advisory committee a couple of years ago that recommended a lot of these changes. So all families are living independently, no sort of subfamilies, multi-generational households, that kind of stuff. One child is 4 years old. If you have two kids, one is 4 and one is 6. And part of the historical reasoning behind that was one was basically preschool age, other was at school age, which factored into, mostly the childcare cost calculations. This fourth one, I'm not quite sure why that distinction is made because I don't believe it differentiates in the data sources we use, but the assumption is the younger child's a boy, the older child's a girl. It doesn't really matter analytically. And then, so we do assume that all family types are renters and not homeowners. So
Imagine all couples are straight.
well, let's see. So for the 2 adult households, it would be basically averaging the 2 and multiplying it by 2 shakes out to the same as taking the budget for one and adding it to the other. If you're talking about like the gender differentiation. So we don't make any assumption on that. So yeah, assume they're renters. If it's a one adult household, so with one bedroom for singles and married with no children, and then two bedrooms for all other family configurations, including single people with shared housing. These households single parents do not receive any child support, kind of maybe in the same line of thinking as the public assistance piece, although I do know that I wouldn't consider them the same thing. But then again, just to reiterate, we do not assume any kind of public assistance when calculating the budget. So it's really they're earning as much as they need to be able to afford everything. So then I just want to run through a few of the changes that were made in the 23 advisory committee. So Act 54 set them up, they met and ultimately recommended 10 methodological changes that required JFC approval. All but 2 of them were approved, and that actually feeds into the next bullet, which is they also recommended 2 statutory changes, and both of those were passed and enacted. And so for the JFC approval, there was the change which I mentioned relating to food. There was the decision to affirm the use of these childcare subsidies when calculating the childcare budgets. Then there were some changes around clothing and household expenses, telecommunications. Basically, there used to be a blended average that counted for landlines and cell phones. Now it's just fully what's the cost of a cell phone, because that is just the most prevalent use now. I changed personal expenses to miscellaneous expenses, pretty much just to avoid confusion with the new spending category of personal care products, which were added. And all these changes were approved by JFC. The report also recommended 2 things that were not approved by JFC because they related to recommended statutory changes. And that was removing one household configuration where you had 2 adults with 2 children, but only 1 wage earner. And then the other one was to add the new configuration of a single person in shared housing. Because the definition of the livable wage statutorily defines which configuration to use. Rather than trying to deal with that at the JFC level, they just opted to let the process that was going to happen anyway deal with those changes. And then, yeah, so like I said, the legislative process yielded that single person shared housing was now the new basis for the official livable wage. And previously, the livable wage had been calculated as being the average for that previous household configuration between urban and rural. There was quite a lot of discussion on this point in the advisory committee. And they thought that by doing so, you were neither capturing the urban budget fully and also at the same time not capturing the rural budget fully. So rather than have one official livable wage, now we have 2. So rather than averaging, we just published the 2 of those separately. And yeah, those recommendations were passed into law during the 2024 session. So that's going through all of the assumptions. Now we can actually look at some numbers unless there are questions.
Thanks. Appreciate the chance to go over this again. In terms of the assumptions around the different regions, is it consistently true that all quote unquote rural regions have the same lower cost structure, or is it possible that some are similarly challenged?
There are some things that we'll see them in a second. There are actually some things you'll see that are more expensive in rural areas, like transportation being one of them is a good example. But generally speaking, things like housing costs are generally more expensive in the Chittenden County area, generally. Now, there was a lot of discussion about, well, also that we have these other sort of, I think they were referring to them as sort of resort towns, thinking like Stowe, Woodstock, some of those other very popular areas that have a higher cost of living that compared to other parts of the state that maybe aren't very appropriately lumped in with rural, right? So again, it kind of runs into data collection issues to really delineate some of that stuff.
Upper Valley to just general.
Yeah.
Wasn't impressive through the window.
Um, so next, I just want to show you how the basic needs budget from 2022, which was the previous report, changed to 24. And there's actually a couple of interesting callouts because, 22 to 24, period of really high inflation, touching basically anything people consume. But what's interesting is you'll see for a single person with two kids, a two-adult household with two wage earners, you actually see that their budgets went down. Reason being, if anyone wants to guess,
Tax credits.
childcare subsidies, yeah. And I guess inflation was just in other areas was just enough to offset the change for the single person with one child, but generally speaking, for all those people who don't have childcare as a component of their budgets, they saw pretty dramatic increases in the calculated livable wages. Like I said, housing inflation, healthcare, cost of healthcare, all those kinds of things really went up quite a bit in that 2-year period. So we did see some rather significant jumps there. And I will also note with some of the technical advisory changes, adding only cell phone coverage in telecommunications, that's more expensive. Considering or adding personal care products, that's a new cost category that was not considered. So not all inflation factoring into some of these increases, but inflation certainly is a key contributor to a lot of this. So this is the same, looking at the same table, only focusing on the rural areas. Again, you'll see the households that were able to access the childcare subsidies, seeing decreases in their budgets, while everyone else seeing close to, over 9% at least increases in their budgets from 22 to 24. So I think what I have next is actually looking at how this breaks out by component. So at the urban and rural components, and then each subcategory, you'll see here, for example, housing, much more expensive in the urban compared to the rural area. And one thing I'll just note is that we are assuming a 2 households. It's not going to be perfect everywhere, right? We're assuming for these people, we have to assume a 2-bedroom apartment because they're single and shared housing. They're not going to be cohabitating like the 2-adult household without kids, where we are assuming that. And it's 2 bedrooms divided by 2 because there are 2 of them. But yeah, like I mentioned, you actually see for rural, the transportation budget's actually more expensive than an urban area. And then, yeah, those are kind of the 2 primary areas that are different here. But you can see that, over the course of the year, cursor there is, it comes out to about almost $2 difference in the hourly wage. Those 2 sort of primary differences there. And then, yeah, we also have a tax component, which we run them through sort of a standardized sort of pro forma run through.
Representative Feltes?
Well, why, back over here on the left column, why would you consider savings to be different between urban and rural?
Savings for the purpose of this report is just set equal to 5% of their annual budget. So it's just based on 5%, sort of a blanket consideration. And one question that we do often get is, do you account for debt or like credit card debt or student loans or things like that? And this report doesn't take that into consideration, although that is the reality for a lot of people.
So the housing, how did you get to that housing? I'm looking at 641, single person, okay, so $1,200, $1,280, $1,300 for an apartment, 2-bedroom apartment. I just can't find that anywhere around us.
So the full rent would be double that, right? Because it's just this person's
Right,
portion of that rent. But what we use for the data sources, we use the HUD survey, the Housing Urban Development one. And from that, we take I'm forgetting if it's 30th, I think it's 40th percentile rental unit in that area. They do their survey on a county by county basis, so we would take the average for all the non-Chittenden counties and then just the Chittenden County figure. And they collect it for a 1, 2, 3, and I think 4+ bedroom rental. So for that particular data point, we're relying on the HUD figures.
Okay.
And so it's 30th or 40th percentile because it's going to be considered to not be the nicest accommodations, but at the same time, not be dilapidated and, unlivable, basically. Again, it's not going to be true in every case, right? If you're just looking at the 40th percentile for how much it costs.
Does transportation, it's sort of gas, insurance, and car payment?
Yeah, so it includes both the costs of owning and operating and also financing. Yeah. I can leave this up a little longer if people are still digesting.
This is so much more fun than last time we did it, and I think it's just because my brain has more space to fit. Thanks, Pat, for coming back. What?
How'd you do that?
Yeah, give my brain more attention?
Okay.
I think last time we were like,
We're in a pavilion.
we were trying to do 101s and trying to do ed policy at the same time. It was like a little too much. Yeah. There were hands, but I don't know where they were. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I have a few charts here. First one is comparing the livable wage, Vermont's minimum wage, and the federal minimum wage. Those are all three different, and this is really just kind of for comparative purposes. You remember earlier on, I said this is not a mandate. It doesn't affect what the minimum wage should be, but as you know, in Vermont, we peg our minimum wage to CPI, so it should broadly be following inflation each year with the update. And you can see the basic needs budget is generally, and this is for the old statutorily defined livable wage household configuration, the 2-adult household. I can't do the historical thing because the single and shared housing is a brand new type. But for consistency, for that household type, it's generally always been about $3-4 above where the Vermont minimum wage is. And then, the federal minimum wage has been stuck there for decades at this point. So that's just flatlining. But, for the most recent year, you can see the minimum wage was $13.67. The Vermont livable wage would have been $17.41. So like I said, like a $4 difference there. And I wish I was better at mental math just so I could figure out what $4 over 2,080 hours in a year is. But just to show you sort of what the difference in the budget would be. But I don't have to, I guess, because here we've got the single adult, one child wage comparison. So there's the federal poverty level to like 20,000. Full-time at the Vermont minimum wage would be about 28,000. For this household type in an urban area, that would equate to, more than double what the Vermont minimum wage could afford. And then in the rural area, about double. And if I remember correctly, when I had this slide up last time and we looked at the median family income, Representative Feltus you actually identified that it wasn't a great comparison because there could be two wage earners in a two-person household. Whereas the comparison here was for a single adult with one child. But the other one we're going to look at maybe hopefully will be a little better comparison. So this is still the same configuration. And what I just wanted to show you down in sort of percent terms where those dollars sort of get allocated. About 11% is in taxes. The highest, which I think will make sense to everyone, is allocated to housing. For this particular budget, it's about 25% of the total household budget is going to housing. Transportation, another big one, the personal and household expenses, another big one. But, you know, sort of generally true amongst most of the households. Housing is generally one of the, if not the most expensive spending category that we calculated.
What in the? How does Dr. Dinosaur fit into?
To be honest, no one does that part of the calculation. I know he uses is it the Vermont Cares database? I might be getting that name wrong. But I'm not quite sure how that factors in, or if he's considering that, because we do actually assume that all the households in here rely on a employer provided healthcare plan. So when he's looking at it, he is looking at
So then it wouldn't.
Yeah, we wouldn't. I
Dinosaur
just
then.
needed to think that through, yeah.
Okay, problem.
Yeah, so yeah, and as part of it, he does calculate sort of typical out-of-pocket expenses. I know that much.
Yeah. There was no.
I also find this information on childcare interesting. Because that says 8%, and aren't the advocates for childcare saying they want it to be below 10%? As if it is much more than 10% now?
Well, I guess my question would be 10% of, are they referencing maybe
Probably a family
average?
income.
Are they maybe referencing average Vermont income?
My recollection is the advocates are saying their goal is to get childcare expenses below, no family should pay more than 10% of their income for childcare. That's the mantra of the advocates. And here we show 8 for an adult and one child.
Well, I will note that these are all theoretical households, right?
Yeah.
So they're not necessarily going to be based in any real information out there. You know, we have our assumptions that we use for it, but that's not always going to line up super well with, you know, every living situation. So there will definitely be some variance in there.
What this all sort of points to for me is just like a desperate desire to see that like great big stacked benefits, wages diagram at some point in the next 5 years. Yeah. Representative Holcomb.
I mean, I think it's interesting. This is data collected in 20 or 22.
24. So a lot of
So
the,
they're still paying 8% on childcare, even with the childcare subsidies.
this would have been taking the childcare subsidies into account. Yes, the expanded ones.
I mean, I think one of the challenges is that when you've got a public benefits program as opposed to a public good program, a good portion of that benefit gets captured. And so you can chase the 10%, but you're always going to be chasing 10%.
What do you mean by that?
There's the cost of childcare has significant, has accelerated as we increase subsidies.
And we're gonna have a really great study about it this summer.
Okay, I have another,
Yes, Representative Mazza.
Yeah, so you're referring to inflated numbers?
I didn't use that word. I'm just saying that it is capture. I mean, it's very predictable that when you increase subsidy, it's why we have private equity childcares now too. I mean, when there's a lot of money in this sector, there's opportunities to make money.
Right, thank you. Just seeking clarification, which I thought I had, and now I got it.
So this is just another household iteration. This is two adults with two children, comparing the different wage types. So again, federal poverty level is about 31,000 for this four-person household. Out of Vermont, minimum wage, they'd be pulling in about $57,000, which, you know, still again, about half what the calculated basic needs budget in an urban area is. And then a little more than half for a rural area. But again, you look at the Vermont median family income and a four-person household, median income was about 144,000 in Vermont. So, you know, still well below sort of what they're below the 50th percentile, I guess, basically. And so the basic needs budget for these household types is just, you know, we're not talking right about in the middle. It's still going to be relative to the rest of the state in this household configuration type, a little bit below what the median is. So again, looking at the breakdown of how the different spending components for this household type sort of shake out. Previously, you saw about 25% of the household income was being dedicated to housing. Here it's gone down to 16, and transportation is actually making up, and food are actually making up more significant relative chunks of the household budget. And again, so childcare in this instance is coming in at about 9% after accounting for the expanded subsidies. So that's actually everything in that slide deck. I have the other one if there were any remembered questions from when we went over it in January, but it is available for reference.
Yep, Representative Brennan.
So the biggest change in the last few years was income.
Could you,
You can't memorize the charts, but biggest, looking back, you know, 2022.
is this the chart you were talking about?
Yeah, is 2010 as far back as it goes? Nothing earlier than 2010?
Oh, no, we could go back further. It would just compress the slide a little bit, but you know, we can go back further than 2010. I think
You think we'd find that it was income, the biggest change, or was it insurance, health insurance, or?
well, I would just maybe, when you say income, could you maybe,
What your check is
yeah,
on Friday when you bring it home, and it shows the taxes that were withheld and the rest you put in the bank
mhm.
back. That's right.
So this report doesn't track sort of household income over time. We're sort of taking a portfolio of expenses and building up to what the income should be. So it's not saying, you know, we're not saying this is what a typical household in Vermont is earning. We're saying this is what a household should be earning in order to afford these basic needs. You know, based on the assumptions that we make in the report. But, you know, I could certainly look at some of those components going back further to see what's growing.
You know, you,
I'm sure housing would be a top contender from 2000.
don't do anything yet, because I'm not sure where we're going with this. So just kind of keep that in your mind.
I think this, in some ways, does sort of the best we have available for seeing how the different pieces fit together, but it's still missing a lot of the pieces, and that'll be, I think, interesting as we go along to see more. Yeah, Representative.
And in the same vein of don't do anything, but if you already had it. Dan Brighton used to do an amazing, do you remember that? I don't know what you call, what kind of figure you call it, but it showed you where the benefits cliff take and how cumulatively, and from that, how we incentivize or don't incentivize certain behaviors. Is that something that is already ready, so that you have prepared?
That was an enormous project. She didn't do it regularly. It was a one-time enormous project by Deb that we are hoping that someday Pat will be able to recreate. And I think we asked you this last time you were here on this particular topic.
Because from a policy perspective, that was incredibly powerful.
It was incredibly useful.
And given how much change we've had.
I do know she was able to get access to some databases that I may not be allowed to access.
Oh,
Oh,
fun.
not in a very legal way.
All right.
I actually wasn't wondering until you clarified.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, there's stated wage, 725, federal 1367 state. But the actual average wage, and then we have the basic needs budget up there, our livable wage. So do we have the actual wages as well? It's often,
I don't have it in this presentation, but that's easy.
Yeah.
I can pull that.
In both cases, we have the Vermont median family income. Is that taken from tax data?
Mhm.
Or do you have some
Um,
other way of figuring that out?
That is taken from US Census data. So it's not going to be tax data, it's going to be census.
And relating
So
to
it's-
different size of the house?
Yeah, it's going to be survey information.
Oh, okay.
So again, everything comes back down to reliability of survey data.
Mhm,
And Vermont can be tricky on that front
mhm.
because of our small sample sizes.
So how do we get the data for a area median income? We often talk about.
But that's again, I think something that the US Census Bureau, they have these annual surveys that they also do in addition to the decennial census. It's called the American Community Survey, where a lot of this information is collected. They put it through a statistical process to help with smoothing. Yeah. And so, it provides a better maybe sort of time series, but they are having to rely on survey information for a lot of that. Yeah.
Well, the Department of Labor does some data collection.
Oh, yeah. And yeah, Matt Barowitz does a lot of work in that area as well.
He has not been in here this year.
He's really interesting to talk to.
He's so much fun. Right. Maybe if we stay here for a few more weeks, we can have him. Anyone else have a question? Sorry about that bad joke. Thank you very much for joining us and refreshing our memories on this stuff. Folks, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and at